All right, aloha everybody. Wish I could turn my video on and see all of you, but my name is Ashley Kierkiewicz, council member for District 4, welcoming you and co-hosting this Transient Accommodation Rentals meeting with Councilmember Heather Kimball. We are being joined by and supported by leadership from the Planning Department, Director Zendo Kern, as well as Deputy Director Jeff Darrow. We had over 700 people register for today's community informational briefing on proposed code updates to the short-term vacation rental regulation. So there is incredible interest in this particular topic. And before I begin, I just want to say a special mahalo nui to Planning Department, Jeff and Zendo and their team, our Corporation Counsel Deputy Jean Campbell, as well as Leslie Chow of the Legislative Review Branch for working so closely with Heather's office and my office on getting us to this point where we are able to really introduce and begin to socialize these changes with community. This meeting is being recorded. And so if folks are unable to stay the entire time, or if you know folks that couldn't make it tonight, folks will be able to go ahead and rewatch today's presentation. In the chat, I'm going to have Jake from my office drop in a couple of links. The first is to download a copy of the proposed changes. Again, these are just proposed. They have not yet been introduced at the County Council. Today is the first introduction and preview with community. He's also going to be sharing a link to a form that will allow you to provide questions and comments after today's meeting on the various sections of the ordinance. Today is merely the first touch point with community on these changes. And later in the presentation, when I go through the timeline, we'll be going over other times and spaces in which we will be convening with you to get feedback. We wanted to make sure that we were walking everyone through these proposed changes. And so we're going to take our time with it. We may have time at the very end for a couple of questions. But again, we do want to take our time sharing with all of you the intention and the proposed changes so that we can have a robust discussion as community. The short-term vacation rental regulation was adopted in 2018, and it was an attempt to really begin to regulate this new phenomenon. And there was a promise made by the Kim administration, the Roth administration, various planning directors and council members to take a hard look at what a second iteration, a cleaned up version of this regulation would look like. And so that's why we're here today. Again, tonight is that first look at proposed changes. It is a work in progress. None of this is final. And we just want to make sure that we are providing everybody with something to chew on. And then we will be working in partnership with community members to finalize what is eventually introduced at council. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Kimball for opening remarks and an overview of today.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you everybody for signing on tonight. The interest in this topic is substantial, and we're just so pleased to have all of you here to help us further craft this bill and hopefully produce the best quality bill that we can before it's introduced to council. So we really do value your input and your time here tonight, and I'll reiterate Councilmember Kierkiewicz's gratitude to the Planning Department, Corporation Counsel and LRB for their support in developing this legislation. So the first question really for us to respond to tonight is why are we doing this? Why are we coming back to review short-term vacation rentals? And for us, like many municipalities around the country, short-term vacation rentals was something that was never actually planned for. And so we find ourselves in a position where we are reacting to current circumstances. Bill 108 was a first attempt to try to respond to how short-term vacation rentals impact and operate in our community. And we've had some time now to see how that works. And it's, with the feedback that we've had over the last few years, that we are coming back to the code and looking at ways to change it and improve it now that we understand a little bit more about how it works. So in addition to just observations over the past few years under the current short-term vacation rental law, there are some other things that we wanted to do with this bill. There was a need to further align it with the Hawaii Revised Statute, so the state laws that apply to transient accommodations. The initial short-term vacation rental bill dealt only with unhosted vacation rentals. There's a need to address hosted rentals, and as Councilmember Kierkiewicz mentioned, there was always a promise to come back and do that after we saw how Bill 108 was actually implemented. There's also a necessity to clarify existing processes, resolve some of the issues that we've seen in terms of registrations, non-conforming use permits, and most importantly, enforcement. Some of the standards with regard to short-term vacation rental were a little bit difficult to enforce because they had sort of a qualitative nature to them. So we've tried to make the standards moving forward much more measurable and enforceable. And then we also understand that there's a need to make sure the short-term vacation rental program within the county is able to be self-sustaining. So that is the reason for us coming back to this legislation and reviewing it. And with that, I'll pass it on to Ashley to talk about the timeline moving forward.
Thank you, Heather. And, you know, a copy of this slide deck will be provided to all registrants for tonight's evening, along with a link to the recording, the feedback form, and the draft ordinance. So today, again, is an introduction to proposed changes. We are going to be keeping that Google feedback form open to community members through the end of the year. So we're hoping to hear back from all of you. And, you know, our team at the county, planning, Heather's office, my office, Corporation Counsel, LRB, will be putting our heads together to do some sense making around, you know, the insights, the questions, the comments that are coming from community members so that we can, again, to further refine and iterate the next, you know, proposed code amendment. We are planning a community input session in January 2023 after we've had a chance to, you know, address, resolve comments and questions that are coming in. We are, you know, still kind of brainstorming around what that input session would look like, if that's something that's going to be in person or via Zoom. Again, as soon as we have figured that out, we'll be sure to provide ample notice to community about those opportunities for you to show up and, again, provide your input. After that session, and we've been able to fine tune and finalize the code update, a bill for ordinance, a draft bill for ordinance will be introduced in committee. Councilmember Kimball and I are targeting either the January 24th committee meeting in 2023 or the first Tuesday committee meeting in February. Again, it just goes down to how many comments that we are having to resolve. Once the bill is introduced at committee, that's another opportunity for members of the public to tune in, weigh in, and provide their mana'o on what's being proposed. From there, we will be making a motion to send the draft bill to both of our planning commissions for their review. And at planning commission, if you're familiar with the process, each commission will be holding their own public hearings. And so again, that's another opportunity for the community to weigh in. At that point, the Planning Commission can provide recommendations on amendments to the bill. They will also be sending their recommendations to the council along with the planning directors. From there, we will be finalizing the bill in committee once we've heard back from the director and the commissions. We will be taking a vote at committee for a favorable or unfavorable recommendation on the bill. And that recommendation is then sent to the full county council for first reading. There will be further deliberation, again, opportunity for public input. Should that pass first reading, it goes to a second and final reading at council, where members of the public can again weigh in a final chance. And then from there, the council takes a vote to adopt the measure as proposed. So that is the timeline for the bill. You'll notice that after we introduce the bill at committee, we don't necessarily specify a time frame. And that's because we just don't know how long it's going to take to get through committee or commission. And so we just, again, wanted to make sure we were being very transparent about the process and what's coming up. All right, going to be launching into the presentation and walking folks through some of the definition updates that you can expect to see in the proposed changes. And so recall last legislative session, the state legislature adopted HRS 273D, regulating what we were calling short-term vacation rentals, and now they are referring to as Transient Accommodation Rentals, or TARS, and that is a dwelling unit or a rooming house that provides transient accommodations for less than 180 consecutive days. And it excludes hotels, apartment hotels, motels, lodges, condominiums, timeshares, and cooperative apartments. Again, that's a definition that we are taking straight from the Hawaii Revised Statute. Additional definitions include hosted TARS, and that's transient accommodations with an operator residing on site during the rental operations. There are unhosted TARS. Those are transient accommodations without an operator residing on site during rental operations. And then also defining principal home, and you can refer to Hawai'i County Code, section 19-71E for the full definition. And what that is a place where an individual has a true, fixed, permanent, and principal establishment, and to which place the individual has, whenever absent, the intention of returning, place for voluntary habitation, and not merely for special or temporary or vacation purposes, but again, for the intention of making it a permanent home. So that is the definition of a permanent home in our county code. An operator is any person that operates a transient accommodation, either as an owner or proprietor, or a lessee, sublessee, mortgagee in possession, or licensee. And that person is engaged in or continuing any property management service which involves transient accommodations. The operator is also the reachable person, again, reachable 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the transient accommodations. Okay. Turning it over to Heather to walk us through the next sections.
Thank you, Ashley. So we are now getting into the actual regulations and the code itself. And the first thing you'll note here is we've made some modifications to where short-term vacation rentals are permitted. So we have added the CN designation, which stands for Neighborhood Commercial, and Commercial Downtown Hilo, the CDH designation. In addition, you'll see that we've added the vacation nodes as another permitted area. This is something that Councilmember Kierkiewicz will go into greater detail at the end of the presentation about what these vacation nodes entail. In addition to the areas where vacation rentals are permitted, TARs are permitted, we have some options for non-conforming use certificates. So if you have a hosted dwelling and it serves as your principal home, you can use it as a TAR. This excludes guest houses, ohana units, second dwellings, and additional farm dwellings. And that's in alignment with the Hawaii Revised Statutes. I did want to highlight at this point in time that if it is your principal home, you can always go the avenue of applying for a bed and breakfast permit, and then you will not have to be regulated by the TAR rules at all in terms of the code. I will go next into the registration, and then we'll talk more about the permitted uses with a non-conforming use certificate. Jake, can we go to the next slide? So one of the big changes in this bill is that all transient accommodations are going to have to register. In the past, we have only registered unhosted rentals. With the proposed changes to the draft legislation, both hosted and unhosted shall register with the county. Those that are in a hosted status before the 15th of this year and have submitted a registration will be allowed to continue to operate until that registration is approved or denied. All TAR dwellings must have their final building permits approved by the building division. They must not have any outstanding zoning code violations, and all related taxes and fees must be paid in full. Next slide, please. So with the registration for a TAR, that there must be there are some things that must be submitted to the planning director. This includes designation of on-site parking, the floor plan showing all of the rooms for rent, and the evidence that the construction is permitted and has passed final inspection. There should be the contact info for all of the registered property owners, including the operator or reachable person, if that is different from the property owner. And if we'll get to this in a little bit about the operator, but if the operator is operating more than one short-term vacation rental, they do need to have a real estate license per the HRS. This is an area where we are bringing ourselves into compliance with Hawaii revised statutes. We also are requiring a notice to the neighbors within 300 feet of the transient accommodation boundary so that they have all of the contact information with regard to the operator of the transient accommodation. Next slide, please. So the owner shall notify the planning director if the transient accommodation rental ceases to operate for any reason. They can be transferred. So upon change of ownership, a file, someone is required to file a change of ownership form and submit a change of registration fee with the county. Here's where the enforcement comes into play. Anyone operating a TAR that is not registered but shall be considered conducting an unpermitted use and shall be subject to the penalties that we're proposing in this legislation. So it is critical that anyone operating a TAR, particularly if they are posting on one of the online platforms, they need to make sure that they have registered their accommodations. Next slide, please. We did build in some exceptions, and I did see that this came up in the chat, and I won't read through all of these, but they come from the Hawaii revised statutes, the same chapter that Councilmember Kierkiewicz mentioned before. Things like student housing, healthcare workers. Next slide, please. If there's an emergency declaration and we need to provide housing for folks, that will be an exception. If there's a home exchange without any money being exchanged, that is permitted without a registration. And this came up, we are using the 180 days as the transient accommodation that comes from the HRS. However, if there is a lease tenant agreement under the landlord tenant code, which is HRS chapter 521. So these are your month leases or your 3-month leases to long-term tenants. They fall in this gray area between a transient accommodation that's for vacation rentals and what's considered a long-term rental, which is 180 days. So as long as there is an agreement through the landlord tenant code, that will also be exempted from registering as a TAR. Again, if you are claiming an exemption and there's evidence to the contrary, that'll be considered a violation of this code. Next slide, please. Back to you, Ashley, I believe. Or is this me? Sorry.
No, it's me. Thank you. Yeah. There are some folks that are using their principal home for a good portion of the year, but do oftentimes travel and want to be able to rent out their home. And so we have built in a temporary homestay section where homeowners may let out their principal home as a transient accommodation rental, provided that this rental is their principal home for more than 300 days of the year, and that the rental is provided for less than 30 days total throughout the year, but again, no more than 14 consecutive days over a calendar year. And we're also requiring that the homeowner acquire a temporary TAR registration number from the planning department if they are planning to advertise this opportunity on hosting platforms like Airbnb and VRBO. The transient accommodation rental operation standards, which I'll be going through a little later, do apply, as do the registration fees. In terms of annual renewal, TAR owners shall apply for an annual renewal and pay an annual renewal fee. This is something that is new. It was just being required for non-conforming use certificates. And so in addition to renewal applications that are being provided by the planning department, folks will need to provide evidence of tax clearance from the State Department of Taxation, certifying that their general excise tax, or GET, and their transient accommodation tax, or TAT, for the TAR rentals in the previous year are paid up. And planning department will also need evidence that real property taxes and the transient accommodation rental fees for the previous year have been paid. Again, for folks that want to continue to operate as a transient accommodation rental, they need to apply for this annual renewal and pay for these fees on or prior to the date that their transient accommodation certificate was issued to them by the planning department. Heather, back to you.
Thank you, Ashley. So going back to the permitted areas, if you are not in one of the permitted areas that was shown in the previous slide, you can apply for a non-conforming use permit. Just like the Bill 108, there was a time frame in which you needed to show that you were in operations to be able to apply for the non-conforming use permit. For unhosted transient accommodations, that window has closed. That was presented in Bill 108. So there will be no further non-conforming use permits issued to unhosted transient accommodations in non-permitted areas. For those that are currently operating a hosted rental, you will have the ability to apply for a non-conforming use permit if you can establish that the transient accommodations was in use prior to 11/15/22, which was last week. There was a question in the chat, why this date? That's the date we began circulating this piece of legislation. And so we are just setting the line in the sand right here that the hosted rental needs to be in operation prior to the 15th of this month. Next slide, please. If you have submitted a hosted TAR, you will be able to continue to operate that TAR until your application is approved. So there's no need to cease operations while you're waiting for your application to be processed. You can continue to operate. If the transient accommodation becomes unhosted and the registration and the hosted non-conforming use certificate will be revoked and a fine will be imposed if you are operating a hosted rental with a hosted non-conforming use permit and it becomes unhosted. Now, please keep in mind, if this is your primary residence, you are allowed to get a non-conforming use certificate at any time if that is required, because it is your primary residence. And again, that principal home is defined in the definition that Councilmember Kierkiewicz mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So your non-conforming use permits, just as they currently are, must be renewed on an annual basis before the expiration date on the certificate. There is an annual renewal fee, and late submissions will not be accepted. If the certificate for renewal is not received, then that is considered by the department to be an abandonment of the non-conforming use certificate. The director has the opportunity to deny renewal if the TAR has been abandoned, the building permits are not finalized, the owner is delinquent on fees, or that there's any violation of the rental operation standards that Councilmember Kierkiewicz will go into shortly. Next slide, please. The hosted non-conforming use certificates may be transferred. However, if it is a principal owner non-conforming use certificate, it can only be transferred to another principal owner. If it is a hosted non-conforming use certificate, it can be transferred either to somebody that's going to use the property as their principal home, or with the evidence that there will be continue to be an on-site operator of that hosted short-term vacation rental. The change of ownership does require the submission of a change of ownership form and notification to the surrounding property owners of the new contact information for the operator on site. Next slide, please. So there are cases where the director can deny the non-conforming use permit, similarly to how there was previously with Bill 108, and that shall be submitted in writing to the property owner. There is also the appeals process within Chapter 25, which is where this code will be. Within 30 days of the notice of denial, the owner may appeal that decision with the Board of Appeals. Thank you. Next slide, please. Ashley, back to you for the standards.
Thank you, Heather. All right. These transient accommodation rental operation standards are really codes of conduct. You know, we want our TARs and folks that are visiting and staying them to be good, responsible neighbors. And so these particular standards, we are asking that they be displayed in the unit and be part of the rental agreement so that as folks register to stay in your space, they're fully aware of what the expectations are. The first is each person may operate no more than one transient accommodation rental, excepting their principal home, unless they are licensed realtor in the state of Hawaii. The next operation standard is operators shall physically reside in Hawai'i County during all transient accommodation rental operations and be reachable again 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by guests, neighbors, and the county. And if there are any changes to who the operator is, this reachable person, to notify the planning department and to be sure to post this contact information in a place that is visible to occupants. Number 3, registration non-conforming use certificates or hosted non-conforming use certificates shall be displayed on the premises, and they should be viewable by occupants and inspectors. And if there is a single address that has numerous non-conforming use certificates, all of those units should be listed on this sheet. Number 4, the guest limit for adult occupants shall be set at the initial registration of your transient accommodation rental and be limited to no more than 2 adults per bedroom and 2 additional adults as a whole for the unit. Number 5, all overnight guests shall be registered with the operator. Number 6, gatherings are limited to 2 times the guest limit that was set at your registration. Number 7, commercial weddings, wedding receptions, or events are prohibited unless allowed by special use permit or use permit that is granted by applying through the planning department. Number 8, applicants shall comply with terms of special use permit or use permit conditions to mitigate impacts of the event, including but not limited to event size, the type of the events, temporary structures, use of sound amplifications, parking requirements, and additional insurance coverage. Number 9, quiet hours shall be from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., during which time noise from the tar shall not disturb adjacent neighbors. Number 10, off-street parking shall meet requirements of section 25-4-51, and all guest vehicles shall be parked in designated on-site parking areas. Number 11, all transient accommodation advertising, whether print or online, including listings with rental services or real estate firms, shall include the registration number, the non-conforming use certificate number, or hosted non-conforming use certificate number. And finally, any commercial signage that advertises a transient accommodation rental shall comply with 22.2.6 and Chapter 3 of the Hawai'i County Code relating to signage. Again, these standards shall be displayed in the dwelling unit and as part of the rental agreement. And TAR operators shall also comply with any private covenants defining rules and standards applicable to a transient accommodation rental. All right, prima facie evidence on the face of it. Again, this is to ensure folks are operating legally and playing by the rules that are established for everyone. And so the following shall constitute prima facie evidence that a transient accommodation rental is operating. First, that they're advertising that offers the property as a TAR, the ability for the planning department to book the rental, that there are receipts from Hawai'i County for transient accommodation taxes. There are reports by third party, and that's in the event that Hawai'i County enters into an agreement with a third party to provide tar listing information. And so the burden of proof will be on the owner and or operator to establish that the property is either not being used as a transient accommodation rental or that it is in fact a legal tar. All right, fee schedules. Heather mentioned earlier that we were going to be establishing various fees. And so there's an update to how things are currently operating. There is an initial registration for TARs of $1,000. And again, these are proposed fee schedules, socializing this with community to get feedback. Initial registration fee for principal home is $250. Initial hosted NUC, $500. Initial hosted NUC principal home, $100. And if there is a change in ownership, that registration fee is $500. Again, these are one-time fees. When it comes to annual renewal fees, registration renewal annual fee of $500. Annual renewal fees for principal homes are $100. Non-conforming use certificate annual renewal fees of $500. Hosted NUC annual renewal fees for principal home, $100, and hosted NUC annual renewal fees of $500. If you are found to be in violation of any section of the ordinance, there are penalties. And so operating without a registration, $10,000. Operating without a required NUC, $10,000. Operating without a required hosted NUC, $10,000. Violation of TAR operation standards, which I just went through, $10,000. And operating an unhosted TAR with a hosted NUC, $10,000. I am going to turn it over to our planning director, Zendo Kern, to walk us through the next few slides related to complaints, violations, public information, and basically the implementation process. Director?
Thank you very much. Aloha, everyone. I'll go through just kind of how the department would be implementing this. It's very similar to what we're currently doing. So we will receive and track complaints regarding any TARs, establish and maintain administrative rules for determining if complaint is valid and there has been a violation, provide information about rules, policies, and procedures pertaining to TARs to property owners, managers, neighbors, and the general public. Maintain a public list of all TARs that have registered or received a NUC and any violations associated with the property. Next slide. And the planning department, planning director shall enforce any violations of the TAR operation standards, TAR administrative rules, conditions of any permits, approvals granted under the TAR section, in addition to fines in the TAR fee schedule. If violations of TAR operation standards are found, the planning director shall impose fines in the amount of 2 times the highest daily rate the TAR is advertised. The owner and operator are liable for all fees, fines imposed on the TAR. Next slide. Notice of violation of a TAR operation standard shall be transmitted to the operator within 10 days of the planning director determining a violation has been committed via certified mail. Service of the notice of the violation upon operator shall be served upon the property owner or operator. NOV copy or notice of violation copy shall be sent to the property owner, if not operator. Within 30 days of the person's receipt of the NOV, any person affected by the NOV, an order may appeal to the Board of Appeals. Order of the NOV provision stays until the Board of Appeals provides a decision. Next slide. Suspension or non-renewal. And so suspension of a TAR registration and NUC, if applicable, for 2 years if the owner or operator of a TAR receives 2 or more enforcement actions in violation of the TAR operation standards. Basically, someone's in violation, they will be put on timeout for 2 years. The renewal of a TAR registration certificate may be refused if enforcement violations are not addressed. Next slide. This is back to you.
Yeah, this comes back to me. We did want to highlight this in the bill and bring it up to date because it has actually been the law per our property tax code, but a lot of folks don't understand that if you do rent out a property for less than 180 days as a transient accommodation, that homeowner becomes, tax class is something that you are ineligible for. Again, this is the current law and applies currently. In addition, the homeowner's exemption applies exclusively to the area that is occupied by the homeowner. Again, if the entire dwelling is rented or leased for less than 180 days, the entire property is ineligible for the homeowner's exemption and tax classification. Next slide, please. If there is more than one dwelling on the property, again, and it is rented for less than 180 days, the entire property is ineligible for the homeowner's tax class, and the exemption applies proportionally to the area used by the homeowner. This is, again, I want to just reiterate and make extremely clear that this is already the law per the Hawaii Chapter 19 of the Hawai'i County Code. Next slide, please. We did build in a capacity for the director to create the opportunities for more hosted non-conforming use certificates if there are hosted non-conforming use rentals that are lost due to an emergency disaster event in a district. Those new hosted non-conforming use TARs will be permitted for primary residents that need to relocate within the affected area. Next slide, please. Back to you, Ashley, for vacation nodes.
Thank you. Thanks, Council Member. In taking a look at some of the data that's been provided by the planning department to get a better understanding of, where folks are operating transient accommodations around the island, we started to think about how we could start carving out, sections of the islands that are providing these accommodations that are not necessarily served by hotels, and so developed a draft related to vacation nodes. And so this is a mechanism that is designed to designate a particular area of the island as suitable for transient accommodation rentals that are not included in what we reviewed earlier. That's 25-4-16A. And so creation of this vacation node designation means that all top TAR operators that are in the specified boundary, and I'll walk everybody through the legislative process on this one, but folks that are operating within that boundary will not have to file for a non-conforming use certificate. And so a vacation node, here's the criteria to establish. A vacation node may be granted if the following criteria are satisfied. That the area is consistent with the state land use boundary urban designation, that the parcels affected are suitable for the vacation node designation and will not conflict with existing uses or designations, that the proposed vacation node will not substantially burden or compromise the use of existing public infrastructure or services. And finally, last criteria, proposed vacation node will not negatively impact surrounding residents or the environment in the form of noise, lights, air, soil, or water pollution. Additional criteria, preference being given for designating an area as a vacation node. Is it underserved by hotels or resort facilities? And they do not have undeveloped or appropriately zoned properties within a 15-mile radius. Where there is a third of TARs that do not conform to the regulations for the zoning district in which they are located. And finally, are approximate to outdoor and commercial recreational facilities such as beaches, county, state, national parks, golf courses, event venues, and other similar facilities. So initiating a request for a vacation node can happen in 3 ways. Initiated by the planning director, initiating by a member of the Hawai'i County Council, or by a property owner or their designee. So if the planning director initiates a vacation node, they submit a proposal and recommendations to the Planning Commission. From there, the Planning Commission will hold at least one public hearing within 60 days of receipt of the proposal from the Planning Director. From there, the Commission will transmit the Director's proposal and their recommendations through the Mayor to the Council within 30 days from the close of the public hearing. And so if the Commission fails to act within 30 days from the close of the hearing, this inaction will be considered as to be an unfavorable recommendation by the Council, and an unfavorable recommendation will be submitted to the Mayor as such, Mayor and Council as such. So that's track one, the Planning Director initiates. Second track is a Hawai'i County council member can initiate establishing a vacation node. And so they would introduce a bill to establish a vacation node at committee. They would then refer this proposal to establish the vacation node to the Planning Director and the Planning Commission for their comments and recommendations prior to first reading. So conversations can begin at committee and stay there until first reading, because we have to hear from the Director and the Commission. And this tracks similarly to when council members propose updates to, say, Chapter 25 of the zoning code. It tracks the exact same process. Once the Director and the Commission have received this proposed bill, they'll submit comments to the Council within 120 days from the bill being transmitted. And so within this 120-day review period, that's about a few months, the Director shall submit comments and recommendations to the Commission and Council. The Commission shall hold at least one public hearing and submit their recommendations to the Council via the Mayor. And again, if they fail to act, this inaction will be considered an unfavorable recommendation and will be transmitted as such to the Mayor and Council. Finally, there is a process for property owners to initiate this process. So a property owner and or their designee may apply to establish a vacation node by filing a $500 filing fee, describing with sufficient detail the vacation node so that we may determine the precise location of the proposed node, providing a map and a plot plan of the vacation node and drawn to scale, a list of statements and reasons for why this request should be granted, and taking a look at the general plan and perhaps even looking at the community development plans to understand, are there goals and objectives and values that are laid out in these documents that are relevant and support the creation of a vacation node? And if there is other supportive information that the planning department, and again, they'll establish this through their administrative rules. If they believe there is additional information that's necessary to providing a proper determination relative to the request, they will ask for it. So as part of this process, the property owner is initiating vacation node establishment. Once their planning director has received a properly submitted and completed application, the director will have 120 days to take action on one of the following: either reject the application or initiate the process to establish one. And so going back to what I mentioned earlier about the planning director going through this process. And so if the director rejects the application to establish this node, the property owner may then submit a request to a council member to initiate this application process on their behalf. If the council declines to initiate the application, then the applicant may not submit the same or substantially similar application within 1 year of the denial. And unless significant new data or additional reasons are provided and deemed sufficient to the planning director, that's the only grounds that are being made available to submit a new application within that 1 year timeframe. Action on vacation node proposal. So within 90 days following close of the public hearing or hearings, again, commissions must hold at least one hearing. But if there is a need or desire to host more than one, they may. The commission shall transmit recommendations regarding the application to council. And as part of their recommendations, they are being required to submit a statement of factual findings to support their decision. And then in considering any proposal to establish a vacation node, the council may issue conditions of approval for the applicant to complete. Conditions imposed shall bear reasonable relationship to the purpose of the designation. For example, we could mandate that there be community outreach meetings as part of this. Revocation of vacation nodes. This may be initiated at any time by the planning director or the county council through a bill for ordinance. All right, that takes us to the ends. Let me see where we are at on time. It is 6:21. There are hundreds and hundreds of comments and questions that have been submitted. Jake, if you can go ahead and also submit to folks in the chat this link to submit questions and comments on the proposed changes. We want to make sure folks have the opportunity after this meeting and after they've had a chance to digest the proposals to submit their feedback so that we are able to take a look at that and do some sense making before the next meeting. I'm going to turn it over to Director Kern to provide some additional manao.
Thank you, council member. So I wanted to say that, this is a polarized conversation, as you can see within the chats. My understanding of sitting on the other side of the desk when Bill 108 or the original STBR bill went through, the intention was to follow back up and have the conversation around hosted rentals as well as vacation nodes. And this is essentially the culmination of that, working with council members as well as the department to come up with something that really looks comprehensively top to bottom. I know there's a lot of information that still needs to be kind of understood and explained, and feedback back on our side so we can make the necessary adjustments and get something that works. Seeing it from an enforcement standpoint has been quite challenging because we basically regulate, we only have registration numbers for the NUCs or the registrations. So folks doing hosted rentals and other elements, some are good operators, some are not good operators. And we're seeing that abuse happening quite consistently. And so the concept here is to try to get it so everything that is some type of transient accommodation really has some type of registration number, whether that's you doing somebody doing a temporary, homestay. That's one thing. Now there is some conversation around people wanting to use, a room or two in their house to rent out. That's a provision that we have inside this bill that will allow that person, if it's their home, they reside there, they'll be able to do that. So they'll be able to offset that income. What people won't be able to do is utilize the additional farm dwelling or the ADUs or the Ohanas, trying to find a balance so we can actually get the ADUs and the Ohanas out there moving, so we can get more long-term housing for folks here on the island. So this is, again, it's a very challenging conversation, but it's a conversation that we need to have. And I think leaning into it and getting the feedback, going through the proper, community input, community feedback process is essential to getting something that is comprehensive and whole. There has been some conversations around staffing to the planning department. So that is something that we'd be looking at depending on how this bill goes, that we'd be getting additional staffing to process. Also taking lessons that were learned from the previous bill to really sequence out how we get everybody registered and in compliance in a manner that is fair to both the public as well as the department. So really a cadence that is just achievable and not really trying to limit any effect on folks while we go through that process. So there's some ideas there as well on how that comes around. But at the end of the day, this is really what we're seeing across the board with the shared economy and with a unique island like ours, and the conversation around tourism is that these elements will be regulated in some way, shape, or form all the way around. And now it's coming up with really the law, the code, the process that works well. And again, this is launching it out here and getting the feedback and making adjustments. Appreciate working with Councilmember Ashley Kierkiewicz and Councilmember Heather Kimball, as well as other staff that they had mentioned earlier. And looking forward to a very many conversations, very robust conversations, and coming up with something that's hopefully going to work really, really good for our community and our county. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Director Kern. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Kimball for some last, some final and closing mana'o.
Thank you, Councilmember. And just wanted to maybe address some of the really simple questions that have come up so far. I think that the definition of operator is confusing to some. It is a change in how the law was previously written. In our interpretation of operator, which comes from the Hawaii Revised Statutes, it is the person that is physically running a hosted short-term vacation rental, or TAR. So that can either be the homeowner if they are there, or if the property owner doesn't live on site, they can have an operator that leases the property, or they have a contract with, to be the operator of the hosted accommodation. So operator applies both to the homeowner in the case that they're renting out their principal residence, or the person that is operating the transient accommodation. Another question that I think I can answer fairly simply is the guest limit on the short-term vacation rentals. The formula is 2 per bedroom plus an additional 2 for the unit over the as a whole. So if you have a 2-bedroom transient accommodation, the guest limit would be 6 guests as renters in the transient accommodation, and then you would be able to have up to 12 people over, for a barbecue dinner or something like that, that is within the standard. So those are a couple that I wanted to answer right away for clarity. But just to wrap us up here, we do really value your input and your questions. We will be sharing this video, I believe, on the planning website, as well as the draft legislation. Councilmember Kierkiewicz at the planning department and I will work on some responses to your questions and get those out into the public forum as well. Please use the link on the screen to submit Google form with additional questions, as well as we'll have captured the questions here in the Q&A. Just as a final note, I want to thank everyone who participated in developing this legislation mentioned before, Jeff and Zendo from the planning department, as well as a number of the planning department staff. We want to thank Leslie Chow from LRB, who helped with the fine tuning and crafting of the language, and Corporation Counsel Deputy Jean Campbell. And again, thank you to Councilmember Kierkiewicz and her staff for working with me on this initial first pass at revising the short-term vacation rental law in Hawai'i County. With that, we appreciate everybody's time, and thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Councilmember Kimball. Again, so great to see so much interest from our community. This meeting is being recorded. Everyone that has registered, over 700 folks, will be receiving a link to this Zoom recording, as well as a copy of the proposed changes to the vacation rental ordinance. We'll also include a link to the feedback form where you can weigh in on all of the various sections that we are proposing. We'll be providing more communication in the coming weeks, including answers to some of the questions. There's a lot of duplication, so we'll make sure that we are consolidating that and being responsive and being very clear about how your mana'o is being reflected into proposed changes. And then we'll also be providing information on our next coming together as a county, as a community in January, to review a next iteration of this bill. Again, it's a work in progress. Some folks might be stoked, others less so, but tonight was really about having that conversation. And so we can disagree without being disagreeable, and I think really come and arrive at an ordinance that folks can more or less be happy about. So thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to join us. We hope this was informative, and we look forward to working with all of you to finalize this piece of legislation. Take care and aloha.
Aloha.